Look at your paycheck. There's the number at the very top, gross pay. That's what you actually earned. Then, way down at the bottom, there's another smaller number, net pay. That's what you actually get to keep. The enormous gap between those two numbers vanishes into the coffers of the federal government thanks to the income tax. For over a century, this has been a fundamental, inescapable fact of American life. We complain about it. We dread tax season, but we accept it as a given. But what if it wasn't? What if, with the stroke of a pen, the entire system was dismantled? This isn't just some fringe fantasy. The idea of abolishing the income tax is a serious proposal that has been debated by economists and politicians for decades. So what would actually happen if we woke up tomorrow and the president announced, as of today, the federal income tax is eliminated? What happens in that first moment? Do we all suddenly become wealthier and happier? Does the economy roar to life, supercharged by trillions of dollars suddenly back in the hands of consumers and businesses? Or does that announcement mark the first step toward the complete collapse of the world's largest economy? This isn't just a question about money. It's a question about the kind of country we want to live in. It's about the very role of government in our lives. Are we ready for the consequences? Because they would be colossal, and they would touch every single person, from a Wall Street billionaire to a farmer in Nebraska. In the next hour and a half, we are going to run a massive thought experiment. We're going to shut off the tax engine and watch what happens to America. Buckle up, because this journey will change how you think about the economy, society, and possibly your own life. So it's day one without an income tax. You log into your bank account and see a number that once seemed impossible, your full earnings, down to the last cent. The first feeling is euphoria. You immediately start thinking about where to spend this new money. A down payment on a house, a new car, that vacation you've been dreaming of. Millions of Americans are feeling the same thing. Demand for goods and services skyrockets. Appliance stores, car dealerships, travel agencies, they're all swamped. It seems like the economy has just received the most powerful stimulus shot in history. But let's pause for a second and look at the other side of this equation. In Washington, D.C., panic is setting in. The federal government has just lost its main source of revenue. We're not talking about a few $billions. We're talking about trillions. To be more precise, individual and corporate income taxes currently account for more than half of all federal revenue. Imagine if half of your salary suddenly disappeared. What would you do? Exactly. You'd either find more money or cut your spending. The government has three options. The first is to just start printing money to cover the deficit. But that's a direct path to hyperinflation, where your saved dollars turn to dust faster than you can get to the store. We won't even consider this scenario because it's economic suicide. That leaves two options. Find a new source of revenue or radically cut spending. Let's look at the first one. What could replace the income tax? The most popular idea, debated for years, is a national sales tax, also known as the fair tax. The idea is simple. Instead of taxing what you earn, the government taxes what you spend. The tax is included in the price of every good and every service, from a loaf of bread to a new Boeing jet. Sounds fair, right? The more you spend, the more you pay. But as always, the devil is in the details. To replace all the revenue from the income tax, the rate of this new tax would have to be gigantic. Various estimates place it between 23 and 30%. Now let's bring this into the real world. You go to a car dealership for a car that cost $40,000 yesterday. Today, the price tag says $52,000. You go to the supermarket and your usual grocery bill is a quarter more expensive. Your extra salary, which appeared after the income tax was abolished, is starting to melt away before your eyes. Let's do the math with a specific example. A family with a median income of $70,000 a year. Let's say they used to pay about $15,000 in income tax, which is $2,500. Now they get to keep that money. But this family spends almost everything they earn. Let's say $60,000 a year goes to housing, food, transportation, and clothing. And now, a new tax of, say, $25,000 is added to all those expenses. That's an extra $15,000. It turns out that this family not only didn't gain anything, they actually lost $4,500 a year. Their purchasing power has dropped. Now, imagine what happens to low-income individuals and retirees who spend every single dollar just to survive. For them, this new tax would be a complete catastrophe. Their standard of living would plummet. On the other hand, for the very wealthy who spend only a small fraction of their income and invest the rest, this system is incredibly beneficial. A billionaire earning $100 million a year might only spend $1 million on personal consumption. Previously, he would have paid tens of millions in income tax. Now, he'll pay just $250,000 in sales tax on his spending. The difference is colossal. Thus, a consumption tax, which seems fair at first glance, actually leads to a monstrous increase in social inequality. The rich become super rich, and the poor get even poorer. Of course, proponents of this idea say you could create exemptions. For example, not taxing necessities like food, medicine, or children's clothing. But then, to collect the necessary amount, the rate on all other goods would have to be even higher, 35, maybe 40%. This would create a massive gray economy. People would start evading the tax on a huge scale, and black markets would pop up. Imagine the illegal trade of gasoline or electronics, like something out of the Prohibition era. Controlling it would be nearly impossible. Moreover, it would kill entire industries. Take tourism, for example. Who would fly to Florida for vacation if the plane ticket, hotel, and restaurant meals are all 30 more expensive than in neighboring Mexico or the Caribbean? And what about the stock market? On one hand, investors would have more disposable income. On the other, if companies face a sharp drop in demand for their products due to rising prices, their stocks will tank. This creates enormous uncertainty, and the market hates uncertainty. So, the first conclusion we can draw is this. Trying to replace the income tax with a consumption tax isn't just trading one for another. It's playing with fire, and it could lead to a social explosion, the growth of a shadow economy, and a severe economic crisis. A few would win, but millions would lose. This path seems like a dead end. But what if the government takes the second path? What if it doesn't introduce new taxes but simply starts living within its means? What if it radically cuts its spending? At first, this sounds very appealing. Less government, less bureaucracy, more freedom. But let's figure out what would actually have to be cut. So the government has decided not to introduce new taxes, but to tighten its belt. Very tightly. Trillions of dollars is not an amount you can save by canceling White House holiday parties or cutting a few secretarial positions. The cuts will have to be brutal. Let's open the U.S. federal budget and look at the biggest spending categories. In first place is Social Security. These are the pensions and benefits for tens of millions of Americans. Second is healthcare, the Medicare and Medicaid programs for the elderly and low income. Third is defense. These three giants devour the lion's share of the budget. Everything else, education, science, infrastructure, national parks, the FBI, NASA, is crumbs by comparison. To survive without the income tax, the government wouldn't just have to trim these programs, it would have to virtually eliminate them. Let's imagine what happens. First, an announcement is made to freeze and subsequently phase out the Social Security program. Today's retirees might still get some payments, but everyone younger is told, save for your own retirement. The government doesn't owe you anything anymore. This means the pension system that has operated for nearly a century, which hundreds of millions of people have been counting on, simply vanishes. Millions of elderly Americans with no other savings are plunged below the poverty line. Next up, Medicare and Medicaid. Hospitals stop receiving federal funds for treating the elderly and the poor. Insurance companies jack up their premiums to astronomical levels because now they have to cover all the risk. A visit to the doctor becomes a luxury. Complex surgeries, treatment for chronic diseases, all of it becomes accessible only to the very wealthy. We revert to the early 20th century, when life expectancy was directly tied to the size of your wallet. But the biggest shock comes from the defense sector. The massive U.S. military budget, which supports hundreds of bases around the world, builds aircraft carriers, and develops sixth-generation fighter jets, is funded primarily by the income tax. Without that money, the Pentagon would have to make unprecedented cuts. Almost all overseas military bases are closed. American troops come home from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Entire divisions are disbanded. Orders for new equipment are canceled. The U.S. military transforms from a global hegemon into a regional force, capable only of defending its own borders. We'll discuss the consequences of this tectonic shift in the next section, but for now, let's look at what's happening at home. The federal government no longer funds the construction and repair of interstate highways. Roads, bridges, and tunnels begin to fall into disrepair. To maintain them somehow, states and cities introduce tolls almost everywhere. A road trip from New York to California becomes a gauntlet of payment booths and costs a small fortune. Federal grants for universities and research centers disappear. Breakthrough research in medicine, physics, and information technology grinds to a halt. The world's best scientists, who used to flock to American labs, now leave for Europe and Asia. NASA cancels all missions to Mars and the Moon and can barely find the money to keep its satellites running. The Department of Education is dismantled. Federal support for schools ends. The quality of education now depends entirely on which state and district you live in. The gap between rich and poor schools becomes a chasm. Let's take a specific example to grasp the scale. The National Institutes of Health, or NIH. This is the main federal agency that funds medical research across the country. Its grants have led to the development of vaccines, cancer treatments, and AIDS medications. The NIH budget is tens of billions of dollars. Without the income tax, it's gone. What does this mean in practice? A young scientist at the University of Iowa, on the verge of discovering a new way to fight Alzheimer's, doesn't get funding. His lab closes, and a discovery that could have saved millions of lives is never made, and there are thousands of such labs across the country. We are voluntarily giving up on the future, on progress, on the chance to conquer disease and improve human life. Of course, supporters of this approach will say, that's not the government's job. The private sector, charities, they should do all that. And indeed, the role of philanthropy would increase dramatically. The wealthiest Americans, having saved huge amounts on taxes, would start donating more to hospitals, universities, and aid for the poor. But can private initiative really replace an entire state system? First, charity is inconsistent. Today, a benefactor is in a good mood and gives money for a hospital. Tomorrow, his company takes a loss and he cancels all programs. The government, however, provides stability. Second, charity is selective. People are more willing to donate to children's hospitals or cat shelters than to sewage system construction or bridge repair. There are thousands of boring but vital things that only the government can handle. What we end up with is a country that looks completely different. It's no longer the United States, but rather a confederation of independent states, each surviving as best it can. The federal government shrinks into a small office in Washington that handles only the most basic things like issuing passports and commanding the remnants of the army. Power and influence shift to state governors and mayors of large cities. But they don't have money either, because the economy has fallen into a deep depression. After all, closing military bases, research centers, and downsizing the government means the loss of millions of jobs. People who have lost their jobs, pensions, and health care take to the streets. Mass protests begin, escalating into riots. So, the second conclusion is this: abandoning taxes in favor of cutting spending is not a path to freedom and prosperity. It is a path to dismantling the state itself. It is a rejection of the social contract, where citizens pay taxes in exchange for security, infrastructure, and social guarantees. This is a scenario that leads to chaos, decline, and possibly even the breakup of the country. We see that both the first and second paths lead to a dead end. But these were all domestic consequences, and the U.S. is not an isolated island. It is the center of the global financial and political system. And now, let's see how the abolition of the income tax in America would blow up the rest of the world. We're used to thinking of the United States as a global superpower. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. The U.S. Navy controls all major sea trade routes. American technology defines how we live and communicate. This entire system rests on two pillars, economic and military power. And that power, in turn, is directly funded by the income tax. The moment we remove this foundation, the entire structure begins to crumble, and the debris flies to every corner of the planet. Let's start with the most obvious, military power. As we've already established, without the income tax, the Pentagon would have to slash its budget several times over. American troops withdraw from South Korea, Japan, and Germany. What happens next? A power vacuum is instantly created in these regions. Old conflicts that were kept in check by the American presence flare up with new intensity. China, seeing the U.S. weakened, might decide it's time to take Taiwan by force. North Korea might feel even more emboldened. A new, even bloodier war could break out in the Middle East between regional powers. The system of alliances that the U.S. spent decades building falls apart. Every country is now for itself. The world becomes a much more dangerous and unpredictable place. Now let's look at the economy. Abolishing the income tax and the corporate profit tax turns the U.S. into the world's largest tax haven. Capital from all over the planet floods in. Corporations from Europe and Asia move their headquarters to Delaware or Nevada en masse to avoid paying taxes at home. Billionaires from around the globe buy up real estate in New York and Miami. At first glance, this seems good for America, an influx of investment, but for the rest of the world, it's a disaster. The governments of other countries lose their tax base. They are forced to either radically cut their own taxes, abandoning their social programs, or introduce strict capital controls, which undermines the foundations of free trade. A global tax war begins, a race to the bottom, where everyone tries to lure businesses by offering ever lower rates. This leads to the degradation of public services worldwide. Moreover, other countries won't just sit back and watch, they'll retaliate. The European Union, for instance, could impose high tariffs on all American goods to compensate for their losses and protect their own producers. A full-scale trade war would erupt, collapsing world trade and plunging the entire planet into an economic depression that would make the Great Depression of 1929 look like a child's game. And finally, the most important thing, the dollar. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is based on investors' faith in the stability of the American economy and government. When that stability disappears, when the country descends into chaos from tax abolition, when the government can't meet its obligations, faith in the dollar evaporates. Central banks of other countries begin a mass sell-off of U.S. Treasury bonds, which were once considered the safest asset in the world. Let's take a specific example. China is currently one of the largest holders of U.S. debt. It holds hundreds of billions of dollars in American bonds. Seeing that the U.S. government no longer has a stable source of income to service this debt, Beijing starts urgently selling them off. Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Europe follow suit. Panic grips the market. The price of U.S. bonds plummets to zero. The United States defaults. It is unable to pay its debts. The dollar's exchange rate against other currencies collapses. All the savings of Americans, all assets denominated in dollars, are devalued. The hyperinflation we feared at the beginning arrives not from a printing press but from a loss of global confidence. This event completely redraws the world's financial map. The world abandons the dollar. Perhaps the new reserve currency becomes the euro or the yuan or some basket of currencies. But the transition period would be incredibly painful. All international contracts fall apart. Prices for oil and other commodities swing unpredictably. The global financial system as we knew it ceases to exist. For America, this means losing its exorbitant privilege, the ability to buy goods from around the world with its own currency. Imports become insanely expensive. The standard of living in the U.S. drops to that of a developing country. So, the third conclusion is this. Abolishing the income tax in the U.S. is not America's internal affair. It is a planetary-scale event that triggers a chain reaction. It leads to an increase in military conflicts around the world, destroys global trade, and annihilates the dollar-based global financial system. By trying to solve its internal problems in such a radical way, America essentially commits global suicide, taking the rest of the world down with it. It is an apocalyptic scenario that benefits no one. We have walked down the three paths that open up after the abolition of the income tax. The first, replacing it with a giant consumption tax, led us to a social explosion and economic collapse at home. The second, radical cuts in government spending, led to the dismantling of the state, chaos, and civil unrest. And the third, a look at the international consequences, showed us a picture of global warfare, trade collapse, and financial apocalypse. None of these paths led us to the beautiful tax-free world we dreamed of at the beginning. So, are we trapped? Is there really no alternative to the current complex and often unfair system? Of course there is. Our thought experiment was deliberately radical to show the extremes, but it highlighted the main issue. The problem isn't the existence of an income tax itself, but its complexity, its rates, and what the collected money is spent on. Complete abolition is like amputating a leg to treat a bruised toe. It's too crude and dangerous a solution. But there are many ideas for reforming the system. For example, introducing a flat tax where everyone, rich and poor, pays the same percentage. This simplifies the system, but critics argue it's still unfair to the low income. Another idea is to significantly simplify the tax code, removing all the loopholes and deductions that allow corporations and the super-rich to pay less than their secretaries. This could allow for lower rates for everyone else without losing revenue for the budget. We can also re-examine the spending structure. Do we really need such a massive military budget? Is healthcare money being spent effectively? These are complex questions with no easy answers. And this is where our thought experiment brings us to the most important conclusion. Abolishing the income tax is not a technical question for economists. It is a fundamental philosophical choice. What role do we want the government to play in our lives? Do we want to live in a society where it's every man for himself, where the strongest survive and no one helps the weak? In such a society, the government is minimal. It collects almost no taxes, but it also gives nothing in return. This is the libertarian ideal. Or do we want to live in a society where people agree to contribute a portion of their income to a common pot to build roads together, advance science, protect the elderly and the sick, and ensure equal opportunities for children from poor families? This is the ideal of a social state. Both of these approaches have their pros and cons. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Our experiment has shown that extremes lead to catastrophe. A move toward absolute minarchism by abolishing taxes destroys society just as effectively as a move toward total state control. So, the next time you're filling out your tax return and looking sadly at the amount you have to give to the government, remember our journey today. That money isn't just numbers. It's the price we pay to live in a civilized, stable, and secure society. Yes, this system can and must be improved. We need to demand that our government spends our money effectively and fairly. We need to fight corruption and bureaucracy. But the idea of just getting rid of it all is a call to return to the dark ages, to the law of the jungle. History teaches us that complex problems never have simple solutions. The idea of abolishing the income tax is a classic example of such a simple, beautiful, and utterly wrong answer to a very complex question. So what do you think? Which of the three scenarios we've considered seems most likely to you? Perhaps you see a fourth path we missed. Would you personally be willing to pay $30 more for all goods in exchange for getting your full paycheck? Write your opinion in the comments. This is a really important discussion, and it's interesting to know what each of you thinks. Let's discuss, debate, and search for the truth together. And of course, if you enjoy deep dives and thought experiments like this, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for spending this time with us. Think critically.